Turkey has intensified its assault on U.S. allied Kurds in northern Syria after President Trump cleared the way. Heavy fighting escalated across the region earlier today. Turkish troops launched airstrikes and attacks on the ground. Turkey claims the Kurds are terrorists, but they've been a crucial driving force against ISIS with American support.
This is only increasing the bipartisan criticism of President Trump over his decision to pull U.S. troops from the region after a phone call from the Turkish president. Charlie D'Agata is in northern Syria.
Well, we just crossed that river from Iraq to here in northern Syria. It's a crossing we've made several times in the past year, but this time it's different. The Kurdish forces who we've accompanied in their fight against ISIS are now under attack themselves from a U.S. and NATO ally. The Turkish military unleashed an onslaught of artillery and airstrikes overnight, targeting Tel Abyad and the Syrian town of Ras Al Ain, both recently vacated by U.S. forces. And that's not all. The Turkish Defense Ministry say they struck 180 so-called terrorist targets across a 150-mile span that includes key cities of Kamishli and Kobani. And they say a ground offensive has begun today. It is already underway. Now, commanders of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces say they've had to put a pause on operations against ISIS in order to face down this Turkish invasion. They also say the offensive has jeopardized the security of prisons housing thousands of ISIS prisoners, risking a breakout or possibly leading to an ISIS resurgence. Now, the military action in the past 24 hours has sparked a mass exodus of thousands of civilians who are trying to flee the reach of Turkish artillery and airstrikes. And the SDF has warned of a humanitarian catastrophe if this Turkish offensive continues at this intensity. Now, we've spent years with these Kurdish forces right on the front lines in their fight against ISIS, young men and women ready to put their lives on the line. They say they feel broadsided by President Trump's decision. They feel abandoned and betrayed. Anne-Marie?
All right, Charlie, thank you. So for more on this, we want to bring in Face the Nation moderator and CBS News senior foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan. So Margaret, just to sort of start things off, I just kind of want to get your reaction to something that we heard the president say yesterday when he was asked about, pulling American forces out and putting the Kurds in a vulnerable position. And he pointed out that they were fighting for their own land and said that the Kurds hadn't helped us during World War II or Normandy. He said he'd been reading what I think he called a very powerful article. I just wonder, what that has to do with what the Kurds have been doing in Syria with and for the U.S. and just, what's the message that it sends? What's the message that it's sending to our allies?
You have an ally, and you're pointing to something that happened during World War II. It would be, I saw Admiral James Stavridis, who was the Supreme NATO Allied Commander, saying, look, it'd be like in the Korean War, saying, Koreans weren't there with us in Normandy, so, you deal with the North and the Chinese on your own.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, this really gets at the essence of President Trump's worldview, which is purely transactional. And that is what is so deeply troubling. If you are a Kurdish commander who fought alongside U.S. forces on the ground and really made up the bulk of the fighters, the United States didn't send in ground troops. They sent in advisors to help guide airdrops, to help guide bombing missions, to help guide those Kurdish fighters who did the fighting so that the U.S. didn't have to defeat ISIS. The president's very proud of being able to militarily defeat ISIS on the battlefield, and there was a whole lot of Kurdish blood spilled and Arab blood spilled in order to help that happen under the umbrella of this organization called the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. It's a mix of different Kurdish fighters and some Arab fighters as well from within Syria. So the president isn't appreciating the reality of what happened there for people who were right alongside the battlefield, alongside Americans. And for those who viewed ISIS and the threat of that as just as, just as hate-filled and ideologically threatening as, say, Nazism, which they were compared to at one point. Remember the genocidal staging of things, mass graves, killing that was being carried out under the banner of ISIS. Many would view that as just as evil and just a direct threat to national security, even though it happened on soil thousands of miles from U.S. territory.
Yeah, and the president hasn't really addressed what could happen if those some 10,000 ISIS prisoners are escape from the detentions and the camps, the prison camps that the Kurds have set up for them,
right.
Because they have to turn their attention to fighting Turkey, which, let's remember, is airstriking with F-16s brought from the United States. So in other words, they're using F-16 planes that they purchased from the United States to launch attacks on our allies. So the question becomes, and we understand that Turkey is a NATO ally of the U.S. as well, so there are no good choices here, but I guess the question for me is, what does the United States gain from allowing Turkey to launch this offensive?
There are no good choices. This would have been difficult no matter who is president, because this was a decision made by the Obama administration back in 2014 to partner with certain Kurdish forces, including those that Turkey considered a terrorist group and called the YPG, and that the U.S. considered one too. But it was the choice of either sending Western and sending U.S. forces in or using local fighters, and the choice was made. Use the local fighters. They have since become really intertwined with the Americans fighting alongside them. And so therefore, to sort of offer them up, to stop defending them, to allow them to be overtaken by a NATO ally, the U.S. is just stepping back in a way that some would say abdicates some responsibility here. Turkey is a NATO ally. The U.S. doesn't want to be caught in a position where they are fighting a NATO ally on the battlefield. That is incredibly destructive to the alliance. That only benefits countries like Russia and others who want to break up that NATO alliance. But clearly here, there are already cracks in that. That's why this is so diplomatically sensitive, and many would argue needed to be handled that way. This would have been difficult for any president. President Trump's decision, though, to just say, fine, I'm pulling our forces out of that border region, essentially gave mixed messages and a green light to President Erdogan to go in on this invasion. Even though the Pentagon and the State Department were warning against this, even though the White House, at least on paper, said they didn't want this offensive to happen, President Trump deciding to give this green light to Erdogan by withdrawing U.S. forces essentially allowed for this to happen. What does the U.S. gain? Nothing. It's what they avoid, and that's what President Trump is arguing here.
So, Margaret, Turkey also recently defied the U.S. and other NATO allies by making a weapons deal with Russia. The president, it looks like he sort of did them a favor here. What's been the reaction within the State Department to all of this and the Pentagon?
Well, so there are these pending U.S. sanctions. Under U.S. law, it's a law called CAATSA. The U.S. was forced to put sanctions on Turkey because it decided not to go along with what it was supposed to be doing as a NATO ally and sticking with weapons systems provided by the United States and the Western alliance, but instead to go and buy weapons from Russia. This was a violation of its agreements, and under U.S. law, it forces the Trump administration to put sanctions on Turkey. The problem is that still hasn't happened. The process was triggered, but the sanctions have been held off because the U.S. has been trying to use that as leverage to figure out a better situation on the battlefield, particularly as it pertains to this northern Syrian territory where it's gotten so messy. But right now you have people like Senator Lindsey Graham and others on Capitol Hill saying, wait a second here. We don't want to be helping Turkey avoid sanctions right now. In fact, we may be needing to punish it with sanctions for what it's carrying out on the ground. So there is this leverage game that's being played. President Erdogan is supposed to come to the United States in November, and some within the administration are arguing that the way President Erdogan aggressively has moved into Syria may be him attempting to build his own leverage so he can push back on President Trump when President Trump says he has no choice but to sign on to the sanctions that Congress has already said are required.
All right, Margaret, thank you very much.
Thanks, Margaret.